Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Building Beyond the Terrible Legacy of Residential Schools, a webinar by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We gathered today across Canada. There are many of you who've already joined us and more coming online. Welcome to this webinar. We come to you from very different parts of this land, from very traditional territories of many different First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. We continue to sort of honor their resilience and their willingness to share ideas and to share the future with us as we try to go beyond the terrible legacy of residential schools. I'm delighted to have you with us today. We've got a very interesting and very full program, so we're going to get to that really quickly. I simply point out by way of background, you've all seen, you wouldn't be here today if you hadn't seen the revelations of the grave sites. Different residential schools across the country. These are stories that were well known among the Indigenous communities. Indigenous leaders and students spoke about these things for decades. Historians started talking about this about 25 or 30 years ago and started writing articles and books and things about residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was held over a decade ago, and it too came out with a whole series of recommendations and statements about residential schools for a whole bunch of very important reasons. The revelations about the graves have really caught the public's empathy. I wouldn't say imagination, but because I think it brings nightmares rather than great thoughts. The country has really paid attention this time. So what we're doing here today with our colleagues, joined here by you'll see them in a few minutes, Tosh Southwick, Chris Sankey, and Melissa Mcbarkey. We're going to talk through what we do next. Where does this all go from here? So what I'm going to do to get this started, we invited Chief Cadmus Delorme of the Cowessess First Nation to join us today. Unfortunately, he could not make it during the actual time itself. So what he did was I interviewed him this morning, and we asked him a series of questions about sort of what did this event mean to their community? How should he think Canada responds? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a series of lead-in sort of observations, and then we get to listen to Chief Cadmus talk about this. And so my first one, Chief Cadmus is Cadmus Delorme, a very patient, calm, gentle human being, has spoken quite eloquently about what this all means to his community. So my first question to him was, Chief Cadmus, what describe for us the pain of these revelations and its impact on your community? Here's what he had to say.
And so the gravesite is the conversation, but the mental, emotional challenges that stem from residential school, the memories, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the mental abuse, the disconnection from family, the the pain, the hurt, that is what has been triggering. And so, externally, everybody stands by Cowessess. I'm so much gratitude is filled by but internally, we are trying to make sure we are there for citizens and families of survivors who have been triggered. That has been the past 3 weeks work we have been doing.
So Chief Delorme was also very apologetic for the fact that he was on child-minding duties, and you get to listen to the Teletubbies in the background. And he has a busy family, and boy, oh boy, is he ever a busy individual right now. The second question we asked was he was talking about the sort of fact that these issues sort of carry over for multiple generations. So I asked him to explain for this webinar the concept of intergenerational trauma and what that means to his community at this time.
What families strive for today doesn't matter race. It's just what families strive for is intergenerational transfer. Grandma transfers the values and the family lineage, the pride of heritage to mom. Mom transfers it to daughter. Daughter transfers it to granddaughter. Intergenerational transfer. That is what I'm assuming and hoping all families strive for. When it comes to Indigenous people, and I'm going to use me as an example. I did not go to residential school. I am the first generation of 4 to not go. But I'm going to give you an example. My great-grandmother, her name was Mary. She didn't go to residential school. And my great-great-grandma Mary, my great-grandma Maggie did. She attended the Round Lake Industrial School. And so what should have happened was the vertical lineage. Mary should have handed it off to Maggie. But Maggie went from vertical to horizontal survival. She stood by her sister, her friends, her cousins to survive. And then Maggie had my grandmother, who is Evelyn, second generation. Evelyn went to horizontal surviving. She didn't get married to Maggie, to Evelyn's, values, family lineage, pride, because my grandma, Evelyn, was in survival mode with her sisters and cousins. My mother came, Charlotte, third generation. So there's 3 generations and not 4. My mother, Charlotte, didn't get the vertical lineage. She got the horizontal, meaning that she was in survival. And then here I am, 4 generations from Mary. And what I should have been today in without residential school being here is Mary's values should have been passed down 4 times to me. Unfortunately, residential school didn't do that. Today, survival mode of that horizontal is still here. And so we're trying to get back to that pure vertical lineage. Some families have persevered. Some families have found some kind of inner peace, some kind of perseverance, which we are learning how they're doing this so we can help others. Other families, they just need that extra investment to just get that motivation back, because everything we do today, Ken, is for our children and children yet unborn. Yeah. But it's our survivors that are the ones teaching us how to move forward.
So you'll notice in both Chief Delorme's comments now, but if you've seen him in the press, he's been very eloquent in talking about the support that they've been getting across the country and the response. You might have noticed that Prime Minister Trudeau visited the community earlier this week. Premier Scott Moe came down to the community as well. We'll talk about that, the purpose of that meeting in just a second. But one of the questions I asked him was, okay, from the non-Indigenous point of view, how would he want people to respond? It's kind of an interesting phenomenon across Canada. People are responding in all sorts of different ways. You saw the wave of people putting little shoes on the doorsteps of schools, for example, as a way, different small memorials, T-shirts that people are wearing. So basically, I asked Chief Delorme, how would he want non-Indigenous Canadians to respond to the revelations of the graves? And here's his comments.
Our pride as Canadians is, on the fact that we have one of the best countries in the world, and we have some reflection to do internally. The recent gravesite findings in Kamloops and Cowes and now others, it gives Canadians a moment to reflect, to understand that, yes, this is a country that is developed. Yes, this is a country that has a governance structure that is, for the people. But the thing is we all inherited something that these governments at one time created to Indigenous people. The policy of residential school, the policy of the Indian Act. The Indian Act imprisoned minds. That was the whole point of the Indian Act, was to imprison minds of Indigenous people. The residential school was to brainwash minds. And it was, this country at one time, many decades ago, that did this. And so, one of the things I find is, we sometimes pride is so high that, the past is the past, get over it. And, and things like that, that tough love. And, and I made my comment live when we announced our numbers. We're not asking for pity. We're asking for understanding. Stand beside us as we heal. We want to be a part of the economy. We want to be a part of the social life. I'm a very proud Canadian citizen, but I'm just as proud as a First People And, I have what you call a dual citizenship. I'm a rights holder, meaning my bloodline has been here since time immemorial. And that treaty, we agreed to share. But that didn't mean that my ancestors agreed to give up who I was to be a Canadian. That is not the situation. So I think the truth, Ken, is the toughest part here, is to the fear of unknown on what is acceptance in the truth. And I feel that, we are in a moment in this country's time where we're going to reflect, but, after this, we are going to be the strongest nation in this world with a great relationship with Indigenous people. But we all must reset our compass a little bit, both Indigenous and non, to make sure that, we are preparing a country that is growth for all, including Indigenous people.
I love your optimism. I've seen it over the years, and I find it really refreshing. And for somebody like yourself,
well, that's unfortunately me doing the interview from a car in Nanaimo, British Columbia. So the last thing I want to sort of introduce to you in terms of Chief Delorme is the other big news he had. Just the news of the graveyard has the one that got most of the attention, but this week as well, they signed an agreement, Cowessess First Nation did, to take control of family and children's services, to assume, again, the control of their children, their families, their well-being from the Government of Canada, the Government of Saskatchewan. So I asked him about what was the importance of this agreement on child and family welfare. Why was this so important? It's kind of symbolic, happening so quickly after the residential school revelations. And here's Chief Cadmus's comments on that recent agreement.
One of the things I have learned, and we have a great team on Cowessess. Our council, our citizens at large, we're very vocal. We want progress. And when I was elected as chief, I ran on the fact that we must adjust, never break what is core to us as our rights holders, but we must adjust to make sure we're ready for the next 100 years. And one of the things, Ken, that I have learned being a chief, and I went to school. I got the Johnson Shiama School of Public Policy. I got the First Nations University of Canada. I spent some time at the Levine School, at Edward School. I feel I have the tools up here, but being a chief, Ken, it's you can't go to school to find out the reality of what a chief has to go through. And loss of control was number one. Loss of control in economics, that is a reality. Loss of control in political control, loss of control in language, culture. We didn't lose it, it's just a loss of control. So how do you control your destiny? And so, one of the things we do is we make sure that our inherent rights and treaty rights are foundational to everything we do. Cowessess has a constitution now. We ratified a constitution. Indigenous people have always had constitutions, but they're oral. They're not written. Cowessess has a written constitution. So we built our Mio Pima Tisiwin Act, our child welfare, based on our inherent rights, based on our constitution. And Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution is there so Canada, we can insert our Mio Pima Tisiwin Act into Section 35 so Canada could respect our inherent right to this. And then that's where Canada has the fiduciary obligation. The province also, contributed to the fiduciary obligation. And so every nation, must gain control. And this is the approach Cowessess is. Children are our future. They're our everything. So we started there. Now we're working on a new governance structure. Now we're working on a new funding model so we can make sure that we do our part as we get stronger with Canada.
So as you'll notice, Chief Delorme and the Cowessess First Nation generally have taken the sadness and the terror basically of the residential school memories, and are already in the process of building well beyond that. They figured out a way that's very important to them. It comes from their own communities. You're going to find three other speakers now who we're going to turn to in turn, who are going to share their visions of of how we go beyond the residential schools. And in no way, I'm not anticipating what they've said, but we're not ever suggesting that people forget it, or don't pay more attention to it, or don't try to understand it more directly. But our first speaker, a good friend of mine from Yukon, is Tosh Southwick, and Tosh is quite frankly, in my opinion, one of the leading people, I'm not sure you describe you as, Tosh, one of the most powerful people I've ever met, and very influential in the North in a whole bunch of different ways. We first got in contact when she was the Associate Vice President of Indigenous Engagement and Reconciliation that was then Yukon College, now Yukon University. She set up her own consulting company, IRP Consulting. She's been a deputy chief. She's a mother of 4. In her own website, sort of describes her as an auntie of many. I would simply tell you that the auntie applies to thousands of people that she's looked after over the years. So Tosh, your thoughts on where do we go from here? You know, you and I both know that residential schools figured very prominently in Yukon history. And the whole idea of residential schools really sits like a bit of a black cloud over the territory. So over to you. What are your thoughts on this one?
Thanks, Ken. First, thank you for the kind words. You're making me blush, which is hard to do for Yukon women, so good job. You know, the conversation is so critical right now, and I really hope that this becomes a catalyst for authentic change across the board. You know, there's a piece of me that has not fully healed as an intergenerational survivor. I too much like the chief you just heard from, am the first person in my family the first generation not to go to residential school. But we live with the scars of that. And so I'm looking for real authentic change. And so what does that mean on the ground for Canadians? The people that have reached out to me, my advice is embrace being an ally. Focus on what it is that you can do to support with your voice and with the spheres of influence that people have. So that might look like asking questions at your children's schools. Why is this not being taught? What is being taught? How are you working with First Nations? Raising your voice when it comes to elections, whether that's municipal, whether that's provincial, whether that's federal, and asking your people that are running, what are you going to do to move the bar forward on reconciliation? Where do you stand on these pieces? I think digging deeply into the truth of what happened. I know it's a hard conversation, but I would tell you that my rule of thumb when I do this work in reconciliation is if we're not uncomfortable, we're not doing this. Think carefully about the semantics, the words that we use. The word school has never felt right for me. I know probably a little piece of what happened to my family at residential school, but it's not a word that I would associate with that. I heard from an elder recently, she calls them assimilation camps. There's a reason she's chosen that word. And so I would hope our allies dig into that reasoning behind that. What does that look like? And I think demand better from our governments across the board. Provincial, territorial, look for reconciliation, authentic reconciliation. Ask them why the TRC calls to action are not being fulfilled. The TRC calls to action are a roadmap forward. Even if we do one of those recommendations a year, things will improve greatly. But it's going to take the voice of Canadians to keep that paramount so it doesn't fade. And one of the realities with the recent discoveries is that reconciliation was fading. Where we were having an opportunity to have these conversations at almost every conference, whether that be in education, healthcare, justice, it was fading. This discovery has just brought us another opportunity to actually make that authentic change. And I would reach out to every Canadian to embrace that opportunity, as hard as it is, with empathy, with authenticity, and with a deep commitment not to let it fade. And I'll stop there, Ken. Thanks.
Our next speaker. I noticed you used the word authentic, and I'm not going to put you on the spot too much, but a little bit, because authentic actually suggests there's something that's not authentic. What do you mean by not authentic? I mean, is that superficial? Oh my gosh, we're really sad and sorry, and then it disappears in a while. What do you mean by not being authentic?
Yeah, for me, it's if you're doing it because it's the socially polite thing to do, that's not authentic. If you're reading off of a script of a land acknowledgement because that's what your company does, because every other company does it, then that's not authentic. If you're looking into creating a relationship with an Indigenous community so that you can get a proposal successful on a bid, that's not authentic. But if you're truly embracing this conversation about how can an individual, a Canadian, in their sphere of influence make an impact on reconciliation, that authenticity will shine through. and it will be the thing that you can go back to even when conversations go sideways.
Super. Thanks very much, Tosh. We're going to come back to you with more questions. You're not off the hook yet, but thank you very much for that very wonderful sort of statement. Our next speaker is Melissa Mcbarkey. Melissa is from Alberta. She's works with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a wonderful colleague. You may have seen her op-ed pieces showing up with considerable regularity these days. Melissa has some very, very strong and very eloquent points of view. She's a very much a community-based person. She comes to these national issues on the basis of what her neighbors and her grandmother and her other community leaders have to say. And she very much believes in the fact that we can build reconciliation, but perhaps not in the not through confrontation. But I'm not putting words in your mouth, Melissa. I'm delighted to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ken. My name is Melissa, and I grew up in a really small community in central Saskatchewan. My community had a residential school right on the premise, like right on the reserve. We had another residential school about 40 kilometers away, which was Gordon's residential school. And then we had another school, which was about 80 kilometers away. So that's 3 within one vicinity that I grew up with. We went to school with these children. We've seen the effects that these schools had within my own community, and a lot of people don't realize the long-term effects of residential school and what it really does to our people. One of the great things about my area is that they took Child and Family Services about 20 years ago. So they joined with 4 or 5 other reserves and came up with what we know today as Touchwood Child and Family Services. So we were one of the first in the provinces to undertake this initiative. Another thing that we're working on right now is family healing lodges. Typically, we don't see family healing units as cohesive as the one that we're trying to create. Typically, they're just one person, either the father or the mother, but we're trying to include an entire family in their healing journey. Another initiative that my community wants to do is convert the old residential school to a museum. And being in it is different than hearing about it. And I think if people come into the community and they actually see it for what it was, and they start matching stories to what they've been hearing, it becomes real, and it becomes it's something that people can reflect on because they're actually seeing it. And we're kind of hoping for our community of Muskowgan that this becomes a reality someday. So from a policy perspective, I like to see things from the ground up. I like to see things from a grassroots level and what people are asking for and what they're wanting for. And this is what I strongly advocate for. We do have a long way to go when it comes to reconciliation. But I think, like Tosh had said earlier, if our allies, if they're advocating their MLAs, their MPs, and, they're determining elections and voting to the parties that actually do want to bring economic success to these communities, then that's what we can do as a team, and that's all that we can ask. But like Chief DeLorme had said, we need understanding, we need in this time, because residential school survivors are going through quite a bit. They're not only dealing with the findings of these unmarked graves, but they're also dealing with church burnings and statue topplings. And this is a lot for them because they're the ones getting blamed for this. And I think that is totally unfair to be putting survivors through that. And violence is never the answer to these kinds of issues. We got to think bigger picture. We got to think 5 years from now, are we still going to be burning churches? Stuff like this, we often do hastily without really thinking about the long-term effects, but this is actually going to make it harder for survivors in the long run. And that's the message that I want to get out there to people, that what you're doing is not helping survivors. It's not helping people in my community. It's actually giving them an extra hurdle to jump through. And that is unnecessary. But all I can say about reconciliation is that it's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to take hard work from our communities, from our leaders, from our Canadian leaders, from our parties. It's something that we all have to work on. And I know we can get there. It's just a matter of how.
As always, I'm glad you're optimistic. And the fact that we can get there, you're absolutely right. There are days, I must admit, when I watch this development where I've seen it before. It's the advantage of being an older guy. And we've had waves of this where Canadians got, oh, we're so sympathetic, we're so understanding, and then 6 months later, the hockey season starts and it all disappears. So I hope we can keep it going. I'm really struck, Melissa, by your suggestion about the keeping the residential school as a museum. There's been so many interesting uses across the country. There, one residential school has actually been former residential school been built into Algoma University. It's actually sort of part of it's a big learning and healing sort of facility in its own right. Other communities, Cooper Island being a good example, Lower Post in British Columbia, right near the Yukon border, they're actually bringing the community together to tear them down. The one in Cooper Island several years ago. And in fact, the cathartic effect of tearing it down was very important. For that community, that's what they had to do. And your point is that for your community, remembering is what you have to do. So thank you very much, Melissa. That's wonderful. Our third speaker today is Chris Sankey. As I always say, and now for something completely different, Chris is a terrific fellow. He's actually a Coshimshin individual area up near Prince Rupert. He's been an elected leader in the past. He's a very important, very influential business leader. Blackfish Enterprises, Bitcrude Energy, a bunch of other companies that he set up over time. Chris, like Melissa, works with Macdonald-Laurier Institute, has been doing some wonderful op-ed writings. If you haven't seen his recent piece in Inside Policy, he very quickly after this happened, Chris wrote to me and he said, Ken, I've got something I want to say. And Chris, I know it was hard for you to say it. And if you haven't read the Inside Policy, please do so, because it's a very, very thoughtful reflection on what this, something that doesn't in one sense seem to affect Chris directly. These are, this is in Saskatchewan and other places. But of course, you felt this very, very strongly, Chris. So I'm going to turn it over to you for your thoughts.
Well, first of all, a round of applause for these two wonderful women. I mean, they're really paving the way. My daughter's futures look really bright, and I really commend Melissa and Tosh. It's just not only inspiring, but very heartwarming and very educational. So I commend you too. Look, when I wrote the piece, I was watching what was happening online and listening and talking to the grassroots people, and I remember speaking to some friends and family, and they were saying, look, I don't think Canadians are understanding. And as you know, Ken, I thought about writing that piece for a good 30 days or more. And I thought, well, what can I do differently? What can I do to help the cause? And what can I do to help Canadians understand us as Indigenous people? And so I thought, well, I always say I got to use myself as an example first. And so I thought I better tell my story. I think it's time, people know that what happened back then in residential school still exists today. And all three of us that are on this panel today, we're survivors of intergenerational trauma. The community I grew up in, I had no idea for all those years that the elementary junior high school I was going to was actually a day school. And previous to that, we had a boys' school, we had a girls' school, and we had all this stuff happen. And then it wasn't until later on in life that I started to hear all these stories of the abuse of residential school. Many of our parents never talked about it because they just buried it deep down. They didn't want to let us know. But what did happen was from that experiences they had at these schools, it projected onto us. And one of my siblings, she's only in her 50s, and she was in day school. So I myself and a couple others in my family, my siblings are the only ones that didn't, but greatly we felt that impact. And so when I wrote the piece, I based it all on my experiences of growing up, and which I'll say was extremely dysfunctional. And you're trying to, as a young kid, and I could relate to a lot of those kids out there that are struggling, that people wonder why they're having difficulties at school, whether they're going to school hungry or there's something going on at home. It could be violence, could be alcohol, drugs. It could be a number of things. that kid is witnessing. And so you don't know their story. And so I thought, well, how could I be a voice for those that need a voice? And how can I get Canadians to understand? So I thought, well, maybe if I write this piece, maybe Canadians will be able to feel something. That, yes, I have experienced all those difficult challenges that so many of us experience. Yes, I've experienced the whole downside of drugs and alcohol and violence that has happened from everything from mental to sexual to it was hard. And so I thought, well, I wanted Canadians to feel something, and I wanted them to understand that just because I wasn't that individual on East Hastings or homeless, that I was deeply affected by this stuff. And as so many people have read that story, I got a lot of calls saying, I didn't know this about you. And friends that I confided in finally got to hear some of the stuff that I didn't tell them all these years. But for me, I want to echo what Tosh and Melissa have expressed. That just be an ally and be a friend and be willing to listen to Indigenous stories. And the survivors are going to be the greatest teachers of all of this. And I mean, I commend every single one of them that are walking this earth today, because I tell you, intergenerational trauma is one thing, but to actually live it, to physically live it, to physically and mentally go through it, I can't even imagine. I still feel blessed as an Indigenous person. I'm Tsimshian. I'm proud of where I'm from. I make sure my kids are going to be proud forever and a day, something I had a real hard time with growing up. I want to make sure that they're proud of being Tsimshian and being Indigenous, because that's who we are. But I'm also extremely proud to be Canadian. You know, a lot of people in our culture don't like to identify as Canadian. They identify as their nation, which is completely understandable, and I respect that. I think that's amazing. I identify as a Canadian because we do have a wonderful country. And I've always said that if we're going to move forward in this, we need to be together. And we're stronger together when we work together. And if we can share those stories with one another, just maybe you're going to find out that you have more in common than not. And that's how we're going to move forward, is just be a friend. We're not asking for pity, as Tosh referred to. I keep mentioning that to people. We're not asking for a handout. We're asking for a hand up. And if we're going to do this, we got to do this together. And I always say we're stronger together, Ken. And I'm never going to stop saying that message, because I love this country. I love my culture. I love everybody I work with. There's always some differences that may happen as we go through life, but that's just who we are. It's okay to disagree on stuff and just have an opinion. I also want to let Canadians to know that don't be afraid to ask a question. Don't be afraid to ask something that you feel that might be ignorant, because look, we all say things out of context that you don't mean to be offensive. It's just simply because we don't know. There's a big difference between ignorance and racism. And I'm sure all of us on this panel today could tell you what racism really feels like, from the system to everything that we grew up in. And so I always tell Canadians, like, let's have that discussion. You know, my best friend is white, and he was afraid to talk to me about these issues when it started to come to light, and I told him not to. And he was afraid to be called a bigot or a fascist or anything like that. And I mean, for God's sakes, he's my best friend, and that will never change. And I have so many Indigenous friends from all walks of life. We're all having this discussion, and it's important to build that ally and understand that this is who we are. We have to deal with it, but if we could deal with it together, this country will be even stronger. We have a beautiful culture. We have a beautiful language from all walks of life. And I just think we're going to get stronger from here on out.
And thank you, Tosh, and thank you, Melissa. These have been absolutely wonderful sort of observations and comments. What we're now going to do for those in the audience is I've got a series of questions that we put together. We're going to pass them around the group and ask each one of them, each question for one person. Chris, Melissa, Tosh, if you want to answer something, you can sort of jump in and add your thoughts. One of the things that you've said, Chris, the others, Tosh and Melissa, were too kind. Is to highlight the fact that this is going to be uncomfortable. Actually, Tosh said the same sort of thing. And in fact, it is, as you mentioned, Tosh, it's in that discomfort that we actually are going to find some real healing, I guess, and change as we sort of go along. And just as part of this, I grew up in the same area that Tosh did. I grew up in Whitehorse, and my grade 8 class, when I went in grade 8, the kids were just closing down the residential schools. And so they were being transferred from Lower Post and from Carcross into Whitehorse and started off in grade 8 with me. But a couple of things about this. In grade 8, 30% of our students in grade 8 were Aboriginal. Fewer than 1% of the graduating class 5 years later were Aboriginal. A pretty standard reality sort of across the country. And the other thing to keep in mind, and not, I think sometimes we want to sort of go after, as Melissa said, you want to go after the statues, you want to go after the Edgerton Ryersons and the Johnny McDonalds and simplify something that's actually very, very complex. And I, when I grew up in Whitehorse and going to church, and I was raised an Anglican and being around town, people used to think and describe the Carcross residential schools and the Lower Post residential schools as the most generous things that white people did for Aboriginal folks. They talked about them in the most, Chris, Melissa, I'm sure it's the same thing, that the non-Aboriginal people would say, look what we've done. We've given them a nice bed to sleep in and some good food to eat and school teachers to learn English and to get a trade and all that sort of thing. So as we go through this conversation, realize that this is not something that 5 government people in Ottawa put together and imposed by themselves on Indigenous people. It was something that had virtually uniform support, not 1,000, not 100%, but pretty close to 98%. And I think as you keep that in mind, that's partly where the discomfort is. If for me to stand up and say this, I have comments from my mother ringing in my ears about the Carcross Residential School. And she's a lovely person, but she just saw the world in a very, very different way. So let's start with a series of questions. And what we'll then do, people, please use the chat function and ask any questions that you have, and we'll get to them sort of as we wish. So Melissa, you mentioned the fact that we actually have to still help the people in the communities. So what should we be doing? All 3 of you have mentioned that, and Chief Delorme as well. This is an issue that's alive right now. People are hurting today. What are you thinking of, Melissa, when you say people should be doing something?
Tracking a lot of the funding for mental health or social programs within these communities. A lot of the people right now are in mourning. They're feeling a lot of grief. And I'm just going to share a personal story that happened to me recently. There was an article that went around of one survivor's recollection of a priest throwing a newborn baby into the furnace. And I had asked around the community, what is the validity of this story? And can you confirm that this really happened in my backyard? And it was confirmed. And the person that this happened to, the woman, she was actually really close to my family. And that shook me up, because a lot of the things that I had seen growing up made sense in that moment. And so it's revelations like that came out that are really traumatizing to people. And I think this is where an understanding of how this truly impacts a community, it needs to be spoken. And I think people, they need to listen, and they need to not have their biases and their blinders on when they hear stories like this, because these things happen to people that we knew, that I knew. And that was a really shocking for me to hear, and to know that it was this person that my family was close to. So when it comes to fast tracking services, how many other people in my community are feeling this, and how many are wanting these services today, not tomorrow, but today, that we can, as a government, say, okay, you know what, instead of waiting 5 years, let's start funding these programs today, and let's see where we are in a year. That's one thing that could be done. Another thing that could be done as well is, just going into these communities and asking them what they need. A lot of them want economic prosperity. Maybe they've had a project on hold for years that they want to start up. It's these conversations that we need to start having, and we need to start asking specific communities what they want and what they need, and coming up with solutions on how we can get there.
Thanks, Melissa. One of the really interesting things that came out in your talk is, number one, do not deny the survivors yet again. And if we sort of say, oh, that's silly, no priest would do that, or no teacher would do that, or no principal would do that, if we don't listen and listen really carefully, one of my observations about this current round of revelations is there's nothing new about it. We knew this stuff. Melissa, you knew it. Chris, you knew it. Tosh, you knew it. You knew these things were going on, and if we go through another round of denial would be really important. One thing, I'm an historian by training, and I remember reading some files relating to the Yukon from the 1930s and 1940s, and they were talking about the kids that were leaving the residential school, which at that time was down in Carcross in the southern Yukon, and one of the church people said the problem for the kids is they're caught betwixt and between. People spent 5 or 6 years teaching them that they should abhor what their parents stood for. They should ignore their grandmother's language. They should not want to live in their houses. They should not want to go hunting and fishing with them. And so they left the school and they went back home. They've been taught to hate it. Not just be something different. They were taught to hate their family's existence. So then they went to work in the non-Aboriginal community and found nobody would hire them, because discrimination remained a central feature of Canadian life, well, right to the present. So here you are. Where are you now? You've lost your language, lost your culture, taught to dislike it, taught to dislike your parents and dislike your family, and now you're trying to fit in a non-Indigenous society that doesn't welcome you. So around you go in a circle. So let's stop being so gloomy. I'm sorry, this is my problem. But Chris, I'm going to a question to you, actually, if you don't mind, and it's one that Darcy has asked as well in the chat, is about this. Melissa just mentioned is about economic development. Chief Delorme said the same thing. He said we want to share in Canadian prosperity. You said it. Melissa said it. Darcy's asking the question: where does economics fit into this as part of getting beyond the residential school piece?
Yeah, look, I'm big on economic reconciliation. I get it. It's about time that we have a seat and a say. I'm working with some leaders right now, and it's important that you just sit down and listen to what they have to say. And for a lot of years, I was so fixated on wanting to get our people out of poverty, having to grow up in it. I just can't stand seeing people having to live in it. So I was so glued on wanting to get development happening, I forgot about all those other things that were so important to us as Indigenous people. Not that I forgot, I was too impatient to want to get to the successes of development so that we get people back to work. In the process of me learning that part over the last 10 years, that I have to also understand we're a cultural people, and that a lot of people feel stronger when they could speak their language. They could pass on that knowledge to their kids. I always say to my son and my young girls, I say, look, thank God their mother is an educator, and she's also a counselor. And we always talk about, look, we're the new status quo. With Tosh and Melissa, we're the new status quo of Canada. And I want that particular knowledge to be now passed down, as Chief Delorme was saying. That's what I want Canadians to see. I don't want them to think of the Indigenous people are having a rough time today, that they see on the streets. That's not who we are. There was a reason. There's a story behind us why you see people in those very difficult times. So reconciliation is about understanding what we want as a people, and we want to be a part of the prosperity of Canada. And I always say that we want to be a part of Canada and not apart from Canada. And Aboriginal reconciliation is a big piece of that. So when we talk about language, when we talk about arts, when we talk about our education or health, we need revenues to do that. And one of the things I always try to say, we can't continue to rely on the government for that. And if we're going to explore the opportunity of economic reconciliation, we got to be open to these opportunities in the resource sector, or whatever that may look like: fish, forestry, gas, oil, hydrogen, wind farms, solar. All those things got to take into consideration, so long as it meets the needs of what the environmental standards are for our people. Because I always believe we could grow the economy while we protect the environment. And who better to look after the environment than the very people that are living in the area to which these development projects are being proposed? And so there's a whole different scope now that's happening. There's some recent reports that have come out. There are more Canadians in favor of watching economic development, responsible economic development, take place through the reconciliation dialogue, where there's more control and more say and more equity for Indigenous communities. It's about time we start bringing our communities up to a whole nother playing field. I want to go back to what Tosh said earlier, how being uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not making change. And I remember speaking with a couple of folks about that very comment, and they were upset. And they're saying, what is going on, in this country? And I don't want to be uncomfortable. And so I sat there and listened, and I said, well, for a very long time, we've been super uncomfortable in our own backyards, where we've been told to be ashamed of our culture, to be ashamed of who we are, be ashamed of our family. And walking into a white collar job or a blue collar job, I remember feeling super uncomfortable in my own skin because I wasn't proud of who I was. And all we're asking is people to just understand and try to at least attempt to make that connection with us, because for 150 plus years, we've been super uncomfortable in our own communities, in our own country. And if we are asking you just to be a little bit uncomfortable with the helping of us understanding to bring this country forward, we're going to grow this country together. And it's just about understanding and being an ally again. And Indigenous reconciliation is going to be a big piece of that. Everybody wants culture. Everybody wants language. Everybody wants economic development. Everybody wants equity. They want a dividend. Well, it takes money. It takes a lot of money. And I believe that that's how we're going to bring our communities up, and that's how we're going to get and lift our communities out of poverty, is through economic reconciliation, having a seat and a say in ownership.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for that. Tosh, I'm going to make a nice, easy question for you, and then put a really nasty, difficult twist on it. When I talk to folks in Yukon about you, basically the words Tosh and reconciliation sort of are hand in hand. And you see this as a very gentle process. I think you're not out there with baseball bats backing people in the knees. You see reconciliation as something really sort of more holistic and more embracing rather than confrontational. So I want you to talk to us a little bit, and maybe using the Yukon as a case study, because the Yukon of 2021 is not the Yukon I grew up in, and it's way better because of that. So what does reconciliation mean to you? And then here's the twist I want you to ponder a little bit. We're getting a very rapid growth in sort of, for want of a better description, new Canadian populations. These are immigrants to Canada, say the last 25 years, and their children. They're wonderful additions. We've seen phenomenal growth particularly in the major cities. The new Canadians don't share any kind of sense of historical culpability. Not their parents and not their grandparents and not their great-grandparents who did residential schools, Indian Act, reserves, all those kinds of things, right? So talk to me about what reconciliation means in your life, but then also about what you see happening with the new Canadian population.
Okay. I'm always amazed, Ken, that you can fit like 15 questions in 2 questions, so that's awesome. I'll take a crack at it. So what does reconciliation mean for me? Well, it is very much about that action piece, whether that's an action somebody's taken to learn the truth. It's really hard to sit across the table and talk about reconciliation if somebody's never heard of the Indian Act or knows what's in it. So I think taking the action to find out that truth and the realities are important. Reconciliation means power shifts for me. If you walk into a room and there are no Indigenous people and you're somewhere in Canada, you're on somebody's traditional territory, you need to question that. Why are there no First Nation people there? The Yukon as a case study is interesting to me because I benefit from my ancestors having done land claims and self-government. I am a child of tomorrow. And so I have the utmost honor to walk through doors that they opened for us, that they fought hard to open for us. And so co-governance isn't this big scary thing that it is in other parts of the country. First Nations sit with the territorial government, the federal government. When we talk about economic prosperity, we're setting targets together on how much of a government procurement, $400 million that goes out every year is going to go to First Nations. We're talking about royalties that go to First Nations. These aren't easy conversations, but they're the norm. I can't say that in every part of the country. When I personally believe that education is transformative when it comes to reconciliation, and I think that there's a huge role for academic institutions in K-12 in doing this. When we were deciding on the new curriculum for the Yukon, it was a given that First Nations would play an incredible role in that decision making. We had the chance to talk to every single province in the country and ask them what they were doing to rejuvenate their curriculum and take a different approach to it. Some provinces, when we asked, how are you working with your Indigenous partners on that, literally laughed and said, why would we be talking to them about this? This is a provincial jurisdiction. That is not a conversation we have here. My kids grow up absolutely still with racism, but it's a different kind. I remember the first time my middle son was told he couldn't come to a birthday party because he was First Nations and they steal. That was only a couple of years ago. Absolutely, it happens. But it's not the same. And co-governance is really, I think, a mutual goal. The other part for reconciliation for me, it is about actually changing the approach to a nation-to-nation approach, making sure that First Nations are involved from the start all the way through as partners and rights holders rather than stakeholders. I always want to get these t-shirts made up that don't call us stakeholders with this picture of a stake on it, because that's not what we are. We're rights holders. We're partners. And Ken, you asked about newcomers, and I think that's a great question. And for me, it's about finding that common ground. It isn't about saying that the Indigenous worldview is better or the Indigenous way is better. It's just saying that it's just as important and it's just as valid. And I think the same for newcomers. I often will try to find that common ground there to say that even though they don't have that intergenerational understanding of the history of Canada, and I think that needs to be part of the courses that they take, it is about understanding trauma. It is about understanding oppression. And lots of the people that are coming to Canada are coming to find a better life. And often in the classes that we teach to newcomers, there's these lights that go on in their eyes and they go, hold on, I came from a country that's colonized. I came from a country where my people are oppressed. So what does that look like? When we do reconciliation for Indigenous Canadians, we make this country better for everybody because we're removing the inequalities that exist. We're making decisions on programs and services based on justice and fairness, not just on equity. And that makes it a better country for everybody, newcomers included. I hope that attempted to answer some of those questions, Ken.
I think I only had 15 questions in there, so Tosh, you only answered 14 and a half of them. But it is worth knowing. Just you look for glimpses of optimism and insight and stuff like that. There's a recent book that just came out a couple of years ago called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, Helping Canadians Make Reconciliation with Indigenous Peoples a Reality. I bring it up to you not to promote it or anything, nothing wrong with the book, but to point out that it's in many of the rankings on Amazon.ca, it's the #1 bestseller in the country. And so, one of the things that is happening is some people are trying to learn and others are not. And it's going to, the uncomfortable part, and you all know this, is it'll get a backlash. There'll be people who will say nasty things. On behalf of every non-Indigenous person in Yukon, Tosh, I'm really sorry your son had to put up with that. I mean, it's appalling that in recent times, this is still a part of their reality. What's even more appalling is that Canadians don't acknowledge that is the reality. I think we have this idea that there are no sort of racial feelings or there are no racial experiences, and we all know that's simply not the case. It's such an important and difficult sort of issue. So, Melissa, this is putting a really unfair burden on you, but I know you're up to it. What do you think non-Indigenous people should do in response to the residential school discoveries? What can the non-Indigenous population do in terms of making things better? We'll come back and talk about government in a minute, but leave that with you, Melissa.
That's a really good question. And it's been a question that many people have asked me. Each community is different. I'm just going to come out and say that. We're not a monolith. We're not all the same. So depending on who's coming out with the discoveries, reaching out to them and asking if they need anything, because a lot of the times, it's just the simple thing as having elder services and elders available to the people. That's a very easy ask and a very easy fix. Now, when it comes to larger issues like social issues, addressing poverty, how are we going to move forward? These are bigger conversations that we can have with our MPs and MLAs, and we can have with our current government system on how we can help communities with unclean drinking water, for example. That could be something that's answered by a neighboring county. Maybe they tie into their services. So this is where the bigger conversations need to happen. And this is where we need to engage those who are around us, our neighbors, essentially, that are close to our reserves. There's not one answer, unfortunately. There's not one, piece of advice that I can give non-Indigenous people. But what I can say is if you have a service or you have an idea of even just a water filtration systems, something like that. A lot of people came forward with different fixes on what could be viable. Well, now this is something that you can take to ISC and say, hey, is this even an option in my neighboring communities? So it's getting those discussions going. I mean, they might be uncomfortable in the beginning, but we will get somewhere if we start having them. Like, we never know where they're going to take us, and we just need to get those happening however they go. And with each new discovery, like we just had another one this past week, it's going to continue. Like, there were 140 schools in this country. So this isn't the end of it. Like, it's going to be a continual process. So we need to start figuring out how we're going to start addressing reconciliation now so that it doesn't amplify into something bigger. We've already seen violence. We've seen statues vandalized, and this is something that I don't support, because when it's impacting community members and it's making them feel targeted because they are survivors, then you're going down the wrong path. That's not the way to go. If we can be positive, if we can be understanding, if we can show compassion to these communities, that would be a great start right there. And anything else that happens after, it's going to be part of the conversation. And these are what we need to be having.
Interesting set of observations, Melissa. I appreciate that very much. I like the comments about the fact that tearing down statues and certainly burning churches is actually, those are appalling acts, and don't really should not get our support. And the vast majority of them are not done by Indigenous people. They're just being done in quotation marks on behalf of. But I like the other side of this, because I think what you've said, and I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that this is not something that should wait for the government of Canada to do reconciliation. The reconciliation is 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 acts of reconciliation. I remember an example a number of years ago in West Vancouver, and you might know West Vancouver, just the other side of the Lionsgate Bridge. It's one of the wealthiest communities in the whole country. And quite without much warning, the mayor and council of West Vancouver basically said, we have the Musqueam, but not the Musqueam First Nation, the Squamish First Nation on our doorstep, but we don't talk to them very much. We shouldn't do that. And so they invited the Squamish leaders to come and sit in on city council meetings and asked if they could come in and sit on the council meetings from time to time. And it was a revelation in both directions. That when they had a chance to sort of talk and they started developing joint agendas and talking to each other on a more regular basis. And if you go to sort of look in that area of North and West Vancouver, you will see some really good actions of partnership, a phrase that Tosh used and Chris, of reconciliation, with working together and solving sort of the problems, to the point where the relationship is not sort of a public issue. It is just part of the lived reality of that area. So Tosh, I've said now that it's not the government's responsibility to solve the whole thing and do all of reconciliation. But give me your thoughts on what you think the government's role in this is. There's certainly been lots of calls for action for, government should do this and government should do that. We've had some relatively small things, some more money for a few things, some of which Melissa's described in terms of support and whatever. What's your view on the role of government in this process of reconciliation?
Yeah, I think government at all levels, again, not just the federal, but provincial, territorial, and municipal, have a responsibility to set the tone for priority setting. What is the priority of the nation? What is the priority of the provinces? And I think they have an obligation to make reconciliation a priority. What does that look like on the ground? I think to start with, a response to this would be really following through on bringing some justice to these communities. There's this conception that this happened, 100 years ago. The reality is there are abusers that are still around. The government has a role to play in holding them accountable and trying to bring them back to Canada so that justice can be served. They're choosing not to do that. That is a choice, right? We should be clear about that. I think the government has an obligation to make sure their public service representatives, their employees, are knowledgeable on these issues. I think there needs to be mandatory training. I don't want to speak to somebody in the Canada, I don't ever want to talk to the Canada Revenue Agency, but when I have to, I don't want to answer questions about, am I sure that I'm not tax-free? You know, like that is a misconception and a stereotype that needs to be resolved and should not have a Canada Public Service rep asking that. I think there needs to be this conversation and a spotlight on reconciliation for every single minister. When we talk about mandate letters, I want to see it in everybody's mandate, not just in INAC's mandate or CERNAC or whatever they're going to be called next week. I think they need to be the stick on funding for the tri-councils for universities. Canada needs to be the stick to say, you have to involve First Nation Indigenous communities from the start, and you have to build authentic relationships, and our funding's not going to flow to you until you can prove that you've done that. And we're going to make sure there's some accountability on the other side of that. So whether it's innovation dollars, whether it's infrastructure dollars, all of those pieces, they have a huge amount of funding. They have an ability to use that to move the bar forward. I think moving forward on the calls to action, it's a roadmap. You know, it's very, very clear. It couldn't be any clearer, I think, that they need to be held accountable for that, and votes need to be. I think the other thing government needs to do is they need to approach this with a sense of empathy. This idea that we're human beings and not a political opportunity for grandstanding. It is about empathy, and I mean across the board. And I haven't seen all sorts of our politicians do that really well, but there are a few that have raised this with integrity, and I think there's a spotlight to be had there. And the last thing I'll say, churches. You know, we're talking about government's responsibility. I want to hear about churches. You know, I think there are, and it's not just the Catholic Church, but there are spotlights that the government needs to be putting on the churches and the resources that they have. Because my last piece, I think I'll say, is healing centers. You know, my family members and friends and elders that went forward, we call them the trailblazers, the first ones that talked about residential school. They didn't ask for money for each of themselves. They didn't want a check. They wanted healing centers built at the site of every residential school. And we've yet to accomplish that. And yet we have these long lists of people who are asking for, you know, like Chris said, that connection to their culture, being able to learn their language, to heal from this piece. Our communities need infrastructure and the ability to create those pieces. I lied. I'm going to say one more thing I think the government needs to do. They need to stop approaching our programs and services from a deficit model that we're broken. We're not broken. We are the most resilient people. I think we've proven that. Even in light of residential schools and the Indian Act, we're still here. We need a model of programs and services that's based on co-governance, not a deficit model. I think that's lots. I'll stop there.
And I could not agree with you more about the last part about the deficit model. Just a quick observation about what happened in New Zealand. Many years ago, New Zealand had a standard sort of, you know, like they have in Australia and Canada and the United States, you know, a Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Office of Department of Aboriginal Affairs. And they used to have all the programming for Maori people in a Department of Maori Affairs. And the government sort of said that's wrong. It sort of absolves the rest of government from having to do anything. And so they said from now on, there still was a Department of Maori Affairs, but it was only dealing with legal issues, legal and constitutional questions. And basically every other department was said from now on, if you build roads, you build roads for Maori people. If you build houses, you build houses for Maori people, and along with everybody else. And you got some really good transitions that resulting from that. Doesn't happen in 5 minutes, doesn't even happen in 5 years, but it changes the trajectory of the nation. And that's really what we're talking about. So Chris, to put it back to you, so Tosh has given this long list of really important things, all of which I would support in terms of the role of government, and a lot of it's signaling, a lot of it's real leadership and things of that sort. But Chris, you know, the residential schools are not the only policy issue facing Indigenous folks. We still have the Indian Act. We still have all sorts of rules and regulations that basically where the government assumes its right to make judgments on behalf of Indigenous people. Do you think the residential school situation is a tipping point for Canada? Is this the kind of thing that's going to force not just the current government, but all the other political parties to sort of sit up and take notice and fundamentally change the way we do Indigenous affairs in Canada?
Yeah, look, it's super important that they pay attention, because right now things have shifted. And at the end of the day, government has to recognize that, look, things have happened. We got to give the support and power back to the communities, and you know, let us prosper. You know, move out of the way. We have more than enough individuals that can help us move forward. I've always said we got to be able to take a chance on our people, and the governments right now just need to make sure that they're there for one reason. That's just to support what we're trying to achieve as Indigenous people, and that's to be independent. I've been listening to the comments around reconciliation and economic development for our communities. One of the things that has been frustrating in trying to move forward in reconciliation, and I always point back to economic reconciliation because that's my area around equity and ownership, governance structure and corporate structure, and getting people back to work. But one of the things I find frustrating in this whole process is how non-government organizations interfere in the prosperity of Indigenous communities that are trying to move forward with economic opportunities in their backyard. For a while there, it was just people protesting gas and oil. Now they're protesting fish, they're protesting forestry. I mean, what else are they going to protest? And it's stifling our communities across this country. It's not helping us. And I always wonder who or what our government, who are they listening to? Because I'll tell you, there are a lot of leaders that I talk to about Indigenous reconciliation, and the economic piece is going to be a big factor on that. All of us want to aspire to putting healthcare centers in our backyard. We all want drug and alcohol addiction centers in our backyard. We want mental health healing in our backyard. That all takes a lot of money. But there are some individuals out there that I believe, in terms of the NGOs, they have been interfering in this process of prosperity for our people. Some actually really believe that we could turn Canada into one big national park. That's just not how this is going to work. And if we're going to continue to go down this road where we're not listening to our own people around Indigenous reconciliation that includes the economic arm, we're always going to be struggling to make ends meet in our own backyard and putting people back to work. You know, every time I talk to our people, whether it's from my community or any community, they would love to go back home. They would love to go back and bring their expertise back home, but they need to be able to go back home for a reason. It can't be just family. People need to work. We need to move out of the way and let things happen and let our people prosper. And right now, I feel that's being dictated back to us in terms of what we can and cannot get involved in, and that needs to stop. We know how to take care of the environment. We know what we're doing, and I keep going back to Tosh or Melissa because I'm super impressed by all the things they're saying, because everything they've been saying is everything that we're trying to aspire to, and just partner and be, relationships is what's going to bring this country forward. It's all about the relationship and coming down to trust and just listening to what we have to say, because we're going to incorporate our culture now. We're going to incorporate what we believe is going to look after the environment. We're going to incorporate how our education system is going to go. We're going to incorporate, like in our community, we use the grandmothers group, where they're able to bring back young kids that never got a chance to grow up in the community or even around our culture. They fly them back in from the city so they get to know who their families are. So there's all those things. They all cost money. And we can't continue to keep relying on the government for that. If we could build a sole source revenue, and whatever that may be for the First Nation, that bona fide revenue, that could help us with so much in terms of having this partnership in governments working together and get our people out of poverty and start managing wealth.
Oh, you guys are covering a lot of ground. That's really excellent, Chris. I mean, it's I think Crystal Smith, who is the chief counselor for the Haisla First Nation. I'm not sure, Tasha, if you and Melissa have ever met her, but this is where the end of the Coastal GasLink thing is coming. And I was interviewing Crystal about the question of, why are you doing this? Because they're talking about building an LNG plant right on their reserve, right next to, right close to their houses and things of that sort. And it seems like the opposite of how Indigenous people would do these things. So I said, well, okay, tell me, Crystal, why are you doing this? What's underway here? And her answer was really interesting, because, to be honest, I was expecting we'd have a talk about money, and we would talk about jobs and wealth and individual prosperity. So if you know Crystal, she's a very thoughtful person, and she sort of said, we only have, and I can't remember the number, was three or four people left who speak the Haisla language. And there's nothing worse than any society in the world could ever imagine than having their language disappear in front of their eyes. And she went on and talked about this, and she went for about 10 minutes talking about the language, but also the culture that's embedded in the language, the relationship with the land. And then she said what Chris sort of said at the end of that, saying, there's no government program ever in this country that would actually allow you to build back that language the way it has to be built back. He said, if we have the money, and if it's our money that we can spend our way, And Tosh, you'll know that the Champagne-Isiac folks right close to York territory have been doing the same sort of thing, right? We will do this ourselves. And it's like, whoa, okay, there was Ken making a whole series of assumptions about economic development and what have you. So here to put you on the spot, because I like to do this, and you guys have been just fantastic so far. It's been wonderful. My sense is this, that residential school revelations were unexpected, in the sense that we thought we'd been through the residential school process. We had an official apology in the House of Commons. You'll remember how prominent that was and how emotional that was. We had a compensation agreement that distributed several billions of dollars to survivors. Not saying it's adequate, but still it was actually done. And I think Canadians had thought that one was sort of almost off the table. Here it comes back with a vengeance. When I think about residential schools, though, it seems to me that it's only one of the, and I'm going to use the word scandal, I'm not sure what the right word is, one of the great revelations we still have not come to terms with. So I'm going to ask you each in turn if there's another revelation out there that you think is going to be next in line, where Canadians will have to be sort of come front and center to what's actually going on. So, Tasha, I'm going to go to you first because you're nodding your head most enthusiastically, and then Melissa, and then to Chris. So, Tosh, what's the next one beyond residential schools where Canadians are going to have to sort of come to terms with the reality?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Ken. And, often when I'm reading in comments on newspapers and when people have approached me to say, well, it was the era that was there. There was lots of corporal punishment. Lots of the kids of that time dealt with the same thing. And I want to be really careful when I say that any type of trauma for any individual is really horrible. But trauma for an entire community, generation after generation, is complex. And it's a fully different scale when we're talking about that. And I think we have to be really clear that, again, I go back to I don't think these were schools, right? The goal of this was not to educate First Nation people and make them prosperous engineers and doctors and lawyers. The goal was to make them white. And so, in terms of what's next, I know several academics who are working on research around some of the experiments that were done on Indigenous people. I have family members and good family friends who know that they had experiments done on them with TB, vaccines. We already heard the nutritional experiments. So I think Canadians should brace themselves for that. There are several court cases right now about releasing records of forced sterilization of young Indigenous women who are in child welfare systems. I think that's coming. I think there is a piece coming about what actually happened. And, we heard Melissa share the story about her close family friend with the abuse outside of the mass graves and the grave sites that are being found. I think there's going to be stories about that. I also think that Canadians should brace themselves for, this is a real issue now. We have kids that are being forced into child welfare. There are a whole bunch of atrocities that are happening there. The justice system, the overrepresentation, those are symptoms of systematic oppression. And that'll continue until the systems are dismantled and we take a close look at why those things are happening. So the inequalities are not old, they're not historic. I have a status number. The Minister of Indian Affairs, according to the Indian Act, is responsible for me as a status Indian from the time I'm born until I die. I'm a ward of the state. I mean, I'd love to send them all sorts of letters and say, hey, where are you for these things? But, that's the reality. So we'll continue to see these things come out and we'll have to keep dealing with them as Canadians. Thanks.
And very worrisome in the extreme. Melissa, your thoughts?
There's actually a couple of examples that I can use from my own community. One of them is the jail system, how it treats men and women differently. And one of the revelations that came about recently was trans men being allowed into women's prisons. We don't hear about this on a national level. It's not spoken about. Nobody's covering this in any way. But it's bringing chaos to these institutions. Women are passing away in these institutions. There was a lot that was going on during the pandemic that shouldn't have. There were women who lost their lives, one of them being a close family member, and she left behind 3 kids, and if we ever wondered how residential schools went under the radar for so long, it's because of this. People aren't talking about it. The same thing is happening in our jail systems. The same thing is happening in child and family. The same thing is happening today. It's something that we hear about, but we often push aside because we don't really believe these things are happening. So we need to get those conversations out there, and we need to start addressing like Tosh had said, the inequities that are happening to First Nations people across the country, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in, the jail system, whether it's in education. There are inequities that are happening today that are putting us at a really big disadvantage. And it's not just Indigenous people, it's really Indigenous women that are, being targeted in a lot of these institutions. And, we need to have those uncomfortable conversations. We need to realize that, as a society, that we're allowing this to happen and we shouldn't be. And I think, I really think the next big thing is going to be the water issue. We put this aside for so long, and, there are long-term health effects as a result of drinking unclean water. I'm an example of that. We had a water advisory for 7 years. And for 7 years, I had like the most painful rashes that you can imagine. And I was on antibiotics for almost that entire time. Now as an adult in my 30s, that's come back to haunt me because I'm antibiotic resistant, and it's long-term effects like this that we don't see until decades later. But by that time, it's often too late, so as a society, we cannot let these issues slip for another 5 years. If that's what our government wants, this is where our allies come into play. This is where they can speak on behalf of us and say, no, we're not going to allow this for another 5 years. You're going to go in to these communities and fix their water issues. And it's not just water. It's everything that you see out there that we're challenging. So I think this is where we can really get our allies involved. And, if we start looking at different issues piece by piece, when we work on them together, there's a lot we can get done in 1, 3, or 5 years. There's a lot we can get done. And we just need to build that roadmap to get there.
Melissa, thank you very much. That's just brilliant. I'd just use an example, if I could, of a place where Tosh and I have spent a lot of time talking about universities. And universities see themselves very much at the forefront of reconciliation and doing all sorts of interesting things, which some of which are very excellent, hiring more Indigenous scholars, putting Indigenous content into the curriculum, all things that Tosh talked about. But we don't actually ever back up and sort of say, okay, what about the fundamental value system of a university? And universities are really highly individualistic. The idea basically is that, Tosh can get 85, Melissa can get 84, Chris can get 62. Can get 49, right? It's all competitive, right? Well, that's nonsense. There's no such thing as competitive knowledge. We can actually all know the same thing, and we can all have the same skills eventually. So universities are busy going through this sort of process of reconciliation without examining themselves to say whether, in fact, what they're doing is actually in conflict with Indigenous approaches to knowledge sharing, language acquisition, things of that sort. So you guys are depressing me really well. So Chris, keep going. My comment here, Chris, is based on the idea that I'm worried, because I'm a worrying kind of person, that residential schools are getting all the attention now, and people think if we can only deal with this one, then everything's solved. So I've got a list now of 8 major items, and you haven't included several off of my list. Chris, what's on your list?
Well, look, I want to go back a little bit because what Canadians need to understand, and I'm sure like a lot of them in my conversations are starting to really pay attention, and their willingness to learn and listen. But when you're stripped of the very culture, when you're stripped of your very culture and language, you become a shell of an individual trying to find identity in this country. And you see so many people now finding their identity, going back to their communities, starting to speak their language, wanting to learn the language and give back. And that's what's making our community stronger. So when Canadians and people ask, they want to compare us to other cultures that unfortunately face genocide or mass killings or just awful things in these other countries that have happened. But what they fail to recognize is that today, like literally today, we are still faced with a mass identity crisis in this country because we were stripped of our culture and our language. But what's, one of the things that I'm always amazed about, and you know me, Ken, I'm vocal and I give my opinion, but that does not mean I won't work with anybody. It does not mean I don't like you. It does not mean I hate you. It means I disagree with what you're doing or what you're saying. But that doesn't mean we can't work together. But one of the things that has always bothered me in this block funding with INAC is that they only spend less than 10% of that stuff, that money, on economic development. The rest is spent on administration, and the rest is spent on Band-Aid programs that just are there for the short term, and they're never there for the long term because you have to be dependent on funding. And that's not how we sustain our communities. It just never works. It's just a repetitive place where you're just going to continue to fail, and you're never going to be able to move forward with that sort of system. So if the governments can finally start using, which, by the way, I hope Canadians hear this loud and clear. First of all, you do not pay for Indigenous way of life. Okay, I need Canadians to understand this. The taxpayer does not pay for our goods and services. I have to pay tax in the city. It's only when you're incorporated on reserve, or if you're collecting a paycheck from the reserve. Everything else we pay tax. But you, the taxpayer, I know it's a little off cuff here, but you, the taxpayer, do not pay for Indigenous living in this country. Okay, I need to make that clear. But that being said, from the bond market, which everybody knows that has worked in Indigenous country, when you're working in our band office, that's where a lot of the money comes from. And I hope the government's listening, that if you could just raise the percentage of that money, which is a significant amount, and put that back into economic and procurement opportunities for our communities to prosper, this country would be a whole lot better off that if we could tap into those untapped monies for our communities. And that also helps to raise the level of opportunity for capacity building. I keep going back to the private sector because in all of my dealings, and I've been at this now for over 10 years, granted, the band office for so many communities has always been the biggest employer. Haisla is a prime example. The Yukons are a prime example of all those wonderful things. The Coast Sibshian and the communities where I'm from all focus on the private sector. And the private sector is raising the level and the bar of opportunities for our people to go out to be successful, whether they're an operator, whether they're a lawyer, whether they're a doctor, whether they're a teacher, or whether they are going to be middle management. That's what's been able to feed our communities. And we need to be able to separate that from what's happening and understanding that we need to be able to be competitive in our own backyard. We can't just keep relying on the same system. So for me, I'll keep saying it, is that if we could go back to the economic arm, I truly believe with the revenues that we generate from our private sector companies that these communities own, we could then take those revenues and maybe leverage money from the system and help our communities prosper and become stronger in their own backyards, and not be afraid to take a chance on our people and our communities. But until that happens, we're going to always have an uphill battle. I wanted to focus on that because I could only tell you from my own experience of the lives that I've seen change in the private sector. Not just the fact that they have a job. It's just the fact that I'm seeing our people for the first time, prior to this pandemic, mind you, fly to Mexico, buy a house, buy a second house, buy land, get back into speaking their culture, going out to take care of themselves physically, mentally, and emotionally. All those things that I'm witnessing and I'm seeing, even speaking to my friends that I grew up, speaking to people that are even younger than me, and them being proud of who they are, that, you know what, I bought this house with my own hard-earned money. Government didn't pay for it, I paid for it. And those are all those wonderful things I'm seeing. And just to see our people get out there to experience the world, because we have such a wonderful culture, that they're sharing our culture with the rest of the world. Not only are they sharing our culture with Canadians, but they're sharing our culture with the rest of the world. So that would be my big thing, Ken. It's just we need to open up that that budget, it start pouring it more into procurement and business opportunities for our people that will save a ton of money for the federal budget on a number of other things they could be focusing on. And having that joint collaboration around protecting the environment, I'm all for that. But make sure our culture is incorporated in that. Our knowledge of the territory is incorporated in that. And that we have a say on how things are going to be developed. That's where I see this Indigenous reconciliation going. That's my 2 cents for economic reconciliation is let's get people back to work. Let's be proud of who we are, because you know what? Before contact, we were entrepreneurs before then. We never relied on a system. I want Canadians to remember that. We relied on ourselves and each other to prosper in this country before that. So thank you.
The problem with you, Chris, is really hard to know what you really feel. That was great. You have been just magnificent. I mean, I didn't mean to end on a negative note by talking about the other list of things, but I wanted to remind everybody listening today that the residential schools are exactly what they are. We know more about them. We know the impact. Hopefully words like intergenerational trauma are now part of our vocabulary. My one that I would have added to the list beyond the wonderful list that you all provided, at some point, Canadians will actually look inside Indigenous housing, and they'll realize the overcrowding and the impact of overcrowding on so many, particularly reserve-based communities across the country. Quite frankly, also in the urban areas where the Indigenous housing accommodations are terrible. The list is formidable, and I guess the message I would take from all that you've said is that we can spend a lot of time identifying problems, but that we're actually far more successful when we identify ways of dealing with them. Reconciliation is critical. Economic reconciliation, Chris would quickly add, is important. Getting those uncomfortable conversations going. I love the fact that both Tosh and Melissa used the phrase of building real partnerships. That in fact, when we get to the point where Indigenous people are partners in Confederation, as they should have been through the initial historic treaty process, right? As the peace and friendship treaties in the Maritimes gave the impression they were going to be, so that we have First Nations had a reason to believe that was going to be part of the future of this country. We're seeing, this is my Yukon bias coming in again, that we're actually rebuilding reconciliation from the north to the south. And we're actually seeing the best examples. I always use the Yukon as an example, largely because it's about 70% non-Aboriginal. You're getting reconciliation in a place with the majority non-Indigenous population, very different than Nunavut. But Chris knows, Melissa knows that in northern Alberta, northern British Columbia, northern Saskatchewan, some really important things sort of are happening. And I think we are moving toward reconciliation finally. Let me just stop by saying you three have been absolutely magnificent. It was wonderful having Chief Delorme to introduce us to his views on this world. He's living this right now in the politics of it and what have you. The three of you were just fantastic. Tosh, thank you for joining us. I can guarantee you it won't be the last time we ask you to participate. Melissa, you're wonderful as always. And Chris, we tolerate you. Chris, you were great. You know that. You were great. Just teasing. Very thoughtful presentations. Thank you to the audience for being with us today. I hope you found this as enjoyable and as interesting as I did. It's an interesting mix of tragedy, but also optimism. And I think, I can't remember, it was Tosh, I think, said it, that Indigenous people are unbelievably resilient. This is not a new concept. It's not, we're finally pulling ourselves off the table. It's not that at all. Indigenous peoples have come through an amazing number of things, from epidemic disease and economic dislocation and loss of land. And my heavens, you're stubborn. And it's wonderful to see. It's great to see that persistence. I end on a bit of a negative note just for Chris's benefit. I think one of the many barriers we have to get past is the discomfort we have in Canada with wealthy Indigenous people. I lived a long time in British Columbia, and there's a good friend of mine he was a great fisherman, very successful fisherman. And he used to, and every couple of years, buy himself a new truck. But when he took it to the store, it would be keyed and people would punch a hole in his tires and all that kind of stuff. So he started buying really old trucks, right? And he started buying really lousy trucks and discovered they left him alone. And that what happened was they just didn't like the idea of an Aboriginal First Nation person being wealthy. Well, Indigenous prosperity, as you've said, is national prosperity. Reconciliation with Indigenous people is reconciliation for all Canadians. And all three of you, in very different ways, gave a burst of optimism about where Canada could be. I just hope the country has the wisdom to actually listen to what you had to say. Chris, thank you very much. Tosh, thank you tremendously. Melissa, wonderful having you with us on this webinar. Thanks, everybody. And thanks as well for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, people sitting in the background, Allison and Brett and Eric and David and all the other people who helped put this together. We brought this in quick response to what we were seeing happening across the country. I hope you'll pay close attention with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We're determined to build a better country. We're determined to build a better country that includes full partnership with Indigenous peoples. Thank you all very much.